Hello, I am Rakaba18. Today I have another in-depth operator guide for you for Rainbow Six Extraction. Today we're going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite characters in this game, and one that I think has one of the highest skill caps. So essentially you're going to, as we talk about this, you're going to learn that this particular operator, Vigil, is tough to master, but his skill cap is extraordinarily useful, and some of the things that he brings to the table are among the most unique things in this game. There's nobody quite like him. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about his progression. So first of all, his utility and his ult is a disruptor, ERC. When you activate it at the low levels, it will only do this for you. And you want to keep that in mind as we talk about this. We're going to talk about his loadout as well as we get further into the video. And then we're going to see some in-depth in-guide or in-game footage for you. Man, I can't talk today. But at the early stages of this, you're going to have to remember that this utility in this ultimate does not do anything for your team until max level. So his disruptor disrupts enemies' senses, making Vigil undetectable for a short duration. Can be used again after a short cooldown. Now, there's some important things to talk about with that. One of the things that you need to know, for example, is that does not mean you're completely invisible. If they get too close to you, Archaens get too close to you, if you do a number of different things, while that active disruptor is up, it will remove it, or they can still see through you. There's some very, very important things to keep in mind. We'll talk about that more in a minute here. All right, at level 2, the cooldown is reduced to 20 seconds, and if you disrupt an enemy team or an enemy Archaean, they become scanned, which means if they see you from a distance, you hit your active scan, and then they no longer can see you and pay attention to you, they become scanned for your team. So he can somewhat you don't want to use him as an intelligence gatherer, but he can absolutely, or at least not in a traditional sense, he can become an intelligence gatherer in a way I'll talk about in game. But you don't want to use him primarily as an intelligence gatherer. He is a stealth class, and sort of a very, very stealthy ninja, and we'll again talk about that more here in just a minute. But the cooldown's reduced and they become scanned if you disrupt them. At level 3, you get the boss G, which I believe is the highest single damage shot in the entire game. I personally don't use shotguns, but that is one of the best ones in terms of at least damage. That one's right up there. Level 4, you get an increased damage reduction by 10%, which is not much. And one of the things that you're going to want to keep in mind, and we'll take a look at this in here in just a minute, is that damage reduction for Vigil is very low, because if you use him properly, you shouldn't take any damage to begin with. So the damage reduction is kind of low there, but again, if you're using him correctly, that's not going to matter all that much. Gear Up is one of the best perks in the game. It means that you carry an additional react explosive. What this typically means, and there's a couple of other operators that have Gear Up, is that you're going to want to use most of the react tech boxes for your team through either Vigil or someone else that has the Gear Up perk. That doesn't mean that they get all of them necessarily, but that, you know, each additional box is going to give them one more grenade than your team would have otherwise. So it benefits your team, especially as you're coordinating through Maelstrom and some of the endgame content, that you want to use Gear Up as a perk that will give you additional explosives or additional utilities. Secondary update at level 6, you get the auto machine pistol. We'll talk more about his guns here in a second. At level 7, you get a disruption duration increased to 15 seconds, and then the cooldown is reduced to 15 seconds. That is incredibly important, one of the best upgrades in the entire game, in my opinion, because for one, you're going to have a 15-second uptime, which is ages in this game. Not quite forever, but it is quite a long time. And then the reduction to the cooldown is 15 seconds. So there's basically you're going to, if you use him correctly, you're going to go, use him for 15 seconds, cool down for a second, take a deep breath, and then wait for it to come back up, and then use it again. And I'll show you all about that here in the in-game footage in a second. Increase to movement speed is huge for Vigil. As you'll see in the in-game footage, movement speed is a big deal for Vigil, and a 35% boost is tons and tons. So let's talk about the last arsenal upgrade is MK14, one of the best guns in the game in my opinion. His super high hitting EBR. So there's that. And then at level 10, one of the most important updates to Vigil is that now your disruption will occur for the entire team, and no matter what their speed level is, that would be set to 4, meaning like if you're using Doc, for example, or one of the slower operators in the game, you're automatically going to have a speed boost, and you're also gonna within a area of effect that we'll see in game, your team will also become temporarily invisible and not like fully invisible. But we'll talk about that more here in a minute. All right, so let's look at in-game. So as you can see here, Vigil is very, very fast, among the fastest operators in the entire game at max level, but his armor level is really low. And so you're going to have to keep that in mind as you use him, especially given the nature of his ability. This is where a lot of the skill cap comes from, in my opinion, in that if you don't use him correctly, he can get into a really, really tight pickle and then die very, very quickly. His armor level is very low, but he makes up for that in speed and stealth. So you want to make sure that you're learning him and utilizing him as a very fragile operator, and one in which you don't want to go and just go crazy and surround yourself with 15, 16 Archaens, at least not in a traditional sense. So let's talk about that more in game here. All right, so his arsenal is really, really good in my opinion, one of the better ones in the game. If you really like shotguns, this is a good one. The only downside to it, as you can see there, is the capacity is very low, meaning you only get 2 shots. And I see sometimes I'll see people using a suppressor on this gun, and I don't know why, because the primary reason to use the Boss G is for the damage. And if you use a suppressor, so 125 damage is substantial amount of punch, and there's almost no recoil. You can put scopes on it and stuff to just depends on what you want to do. I just can't see why you would want to use a suppressor here personally. It sort of mitigates the purpose of the Boss G, and I don't think that that is a very good use of his utility. Weapon recoil or transition between hipfire. I tend to go, if I'm going to do anything with the Boss G, I go with the transition between hipfire and ADS, just so that I'm shooting my gun faster. So if I'm going to use it, that's what I would do with it. I don't personally tend to use shotguns very much, especially this one, because of the low fire rate and because of the capacity. You're going to find yourself reloading a lot. And with Vigil especially, that can be quite dangerous if you're not careful. So it's a good gun, one that I see some people use, but you have to have a really, really high level skill with the shotguns, and you have to be very, very careful with it. I tend to personally use the K1A. I think it's one of the best guns in the game. The recoil pattern is a little tough to control, but it packs quite a punch. It's got 36 damage. The fire rate's decent, not super fast firing. It's really balanced is the best way that I can kind of explain with this one. It's a submachine gun, but it packs like an AR, as it says there. So it's a good gun, and one that I tend to use almost always for Vigil. The other one that I see people use a lot is the EBR, but this one is, again, a high damage, low fire rate with a low capacity. You kind of almost want to use this one as a sniper rifle the same way that you would use like the HK, for example. You want to use this if you're playing Vigil more as a support. Where your team's in front of you taking most of the shots, and you're hitting some hard headshots and stuff like that on Apexes or Tormentors. It can really blow up enemies quickly. I think it even one-shots grunts, or even 2 shots. I'm not sure exactly, but the K1A is if you're going to be more mobile and in the front lines, sort of stealthing your way around the map and getting intel, completing objectives. This one you want to use more passively, sitting in the back, stealthing for your team, and providing them with some stealth, and we'll talk about that here in the end game in just a bit. But it really just depends on your playstyle, and I would recommend the Boss G if you're doing something sort of in between, where your team is surrounding you and supporting you, and you're all kind of equally just moving throughout the map with skill. So just keep in mind, this is all going to depend on what your team needs. One of the things that I will recommend with Vigil, especially as you're learning him, and this goes almost with any operator, is just bring a revive kit. It really helps you recover from some mistakes, and you can learn to increase your skill with Vigil by not having to worry too much about how many times you go down. And as you're learning how to use this stealth properly, that will really, really help your team out. I also tend to just use paralysis grenades as default, and Vigil's operator utility is not going to fully replace necessarily any particular ability, because he does scan and he can gain intel, but that intel is going to have to be then reported through comms. So I don't think there's any particular reason. It just depends on what your team needs. You can use C4s, you can use paralysis grenades, whatever your team needs. One of the things that is really great with Vigil is field walls. If you get into a little bit of a pinch and like some tormentors or apexes surround you, you can throw out a field wall to stop those bullets or stop those projectiles from hitting you. So that is kind of his in-depth guide on the menu. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the gameplay for him, and I'll demonstrate to you why I think he's one of the harder classes to master, but once you do, oh boy, does he bring a lot to the table. All right, here we are in game with a max level Vigil. Just keep in mind, as with all of my guides, this is a max level guide, and the way in which I talk about him and his utility towards the team is as it relates to in-depth guides for a max level operator. So I did forget to mention in the menu before that the best option, in my opinion, for his secondary is the C75. I believe his other secondary is also auto-firing, and I almost never use it because the recoil is absolutely insane. I mean, I think it might be the second highest recoil behind the auto pistol for Hibana. So just keep in mind, I personally use the C75 with a silencer. As you can see, it's got quite a bit of recoil anyway, but it's also a auto-firing, quick-firing silence. This can get you in and out of a lot of trouble in a very, very quick hurry, so just want to try to master the use of this. You're going to want to, most of the time, have this out as a default, and then switch to your main weapon, which for me is almost always the K1A. There are some circumstances in which, as I mentioned before, you want to use the EBR. If you're playing more passively and as a supporter rather than as a frontline stealth intelligence gatherer, that is entirely up to you and your choice within the game. So before we get into any in-depth tips with Vigil here, I want to make sure that we're getting some of the basics down. So I have a revive kit, as I recommend for all operators as you're learning the game, and the paralysis grenade, which is probably the best early level utility grenade. That can change, obviously, again, based on what your team needs and what you're doing. But here are what I will do with the basics. So essentially, you can see here, I am moving around the map, and I am visible to all enemies. If I hit my ult, you can see on the screen there, as indicated by the visuals and by his announcement, he is now in a stealthy environment. So look, you can kind of see, if you look out towards the edges of where that door is right there, you can kind of see that it has a circle as well. It's really hard to see and it's kind of subtle, but anyone in your team that is within that circle will also become stealth at max level. That's very important to remember, at max level only. And then it expires, and then you can use it again in about 15 seconds. There is a little bit of an audio trigger there. You can kind of hear that it is back up and available. So you can hit it again, jump through here. Any enemies in that circle that are able to see me in a normal world will no longer see me. And so you can kind of move quietly through the map, and you'll notice that as it's about to expire, I'll wait another 15 seconds or so just to make sure that that nobody can see me. Now you can pull this out. You pull out your secondary with a silencer. Use this to kind of clean up any small enemies that are in your way. And you can kind of just become something of a stealth operator to gather intelligence as you're learning the map. Particularly in Maelstrom, this is really useful. So you can see that guy will no longer see me as long as I'm not close to him. And so this is the primary way that I recommend that you use Vigil as you're learning and growing with him. There is a second way that takes a lot more skill, and I will demonstrate that here in a little bit. But here you want to kind of just slowly move around the map. Now, two important things to keep in mind. Actually, three. So one, if you stand up and sprint at any time when you're running around, you cannot use your disruptor. So while sprinting, you cannot activate it. You'll see that it's grayed out there, and you can't push it. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that if you use it and then start to run, the cloak will go away instantly. So you want to use this as a quiet option. You cannot run or melee any enemies. You can't do takedowns or shoot your gun, or it will automatically remove that. So any kind of offensive task on your part will automatically remove the cloak. Now you can see that I can shoot those enemies before the cloak goes up. and it doesn't make much of a difference. That's one of the ways that you can continue to become stealthy as you're using him. Now, one thing to keep in mind with the Disruptor is that you can take down nests silently while also retaining your cloak. So let's say there's a nest right here and we're doing nest tracking. Vigil is one of the best operators for nest tracking because I can walk right up to a nest, plant the tracker, walk away. My cloak is still on, hide in a line of sight, away from any enemies that might see me. This also does this for your team. So they will no longer need to kill any enemies around a nest, temporarily at least, and they can run right up to a nest while your cloak is active, plant it, and then run back. That is one of the highest skill cap ability that you'll learn as you progress with Vigil. So the other thing to keep in mind is that this is the way in which you can use, this is kind of an advanced tip, that you can use Vigil for your team. Is let's say I have Joe here and Frank here, just made up names by the way, and I activate my cloak and I don't do anything. They can then shoot their guns, shoot that nest over there, and the cloak will then reabsorb and it will prevent them from being detected. So you can keep your cloak up while your team around you shoots. It will draw attention to you and it can alert enemies, but you can temporarily at least provide a little bit of stealth and a little bit of mobility to your team. So keep in mind that you can do that in a way that will prevent howls, it'll allow you to do nest tracking. So if you that's the way in which you will probably want to use the EBR, is activate your cloak, let your team do all the shooting, and then if things get a little too hot and your cloak's about to expire, switch to your EBR and start blowing up the Tormentor, blow up the Apex, etc. But if you use this cloak in this way, it'll allow your team to continue to remain stealth while doing some damage and remaining mobile. So you can kind of see the way in which this becomes a built-in intelligence gathering thing, because you can gather information without your team having to alert anything. You can move about the map and complete objectives without having to alert your team or alert any Archaens. And then let's say that guy is about to see me, I can engage my cloak, and now he's lost. But here's another incredibly important thing to keep in mind, is that you can do takedowns on enemies that might otherwise explode, which is really, really useful. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, and we may not be able to demonstrate it in this video, is that if an Archaean sees me and then I stealth and I get too close to them, there's a potential that they can still see you. You're not completely invisible at all times with this. It will prevent them from seeing you to start, but if they've seen you and they're running towards you and then they get too close or you're one like right next to them like this, there's a chance that you'll become visible to them. So let's talk about Vigil's utility also as it relates to objectives. So let's say our team is in the middle of a Maelstrom, we're at sub-zone 9, everything has gotten kind of crazy, they're over there fighting for their lives. Vigil can kind of stealth over here, hit this, run as fast as he can without removing the stealth, grab these objectives, do this little takedown right here. So you become a built-in objective seeker here. So you can kind of hit this, move towards the next one really, really quickly here. And they're over there still fighting for their lives. Everything's going crazy. You stop and go stealthy. Nobody will see you anymore for a minute or for 15 seconds. You can come on over here and start to hit the objectives. So this is where the skill cap starts to really hit the ceiling. Is you can complete an objective almost entirely on your own, grab your teams, start to support them. We're all running towards the extraction spot. Very, very important utility there. So you can start to, and as you can see, Vigil does take quite a bit of damage, so you want to be very careful. That's the downside to him. The way in which they balanced him is if you get into a scenario where you've used your stealth and it's about to expire, there's an Apex there, there's a Tormentor there, all of these Archaeans are surrounding you. You have to be very careful because Vigil can go down in a heartbeat, which is one of the reasons I recommend a revive kit for him. Especially when paired with like Doc or Finka, who can then res you and get you out of trouble. So let's say, for example, that this is a serial scan too. Let's talk about the way in which you can utilize him for serial scan. So you all stand on the objective. It's about halfway through. It's fully about to expire and the scan is almost done. You can then hit your ability, and any enemies that are then swarming you will have a temporarily harder time finding you and your team so that you can complete the objective. get to a position where you're safer and can shoot them more easily, and then move to the next objective. There are tons of ways in which you can utilize this utility on objectives and in nest tracking, biopsy, decontamination. All of the different objectives have a utility in which Vigil can bring something to the table. This is why he is one of the best operators, but also one of the hardest operators to master, because there are ways in which this can backfire. There are ways in which, as you're learning him, you're going to make mistakes. Don't worry about it. You're gonna learn from them, and as you continue to master this visible stealth, it's gonna be easier for your team to move about the map and complete objectives. He is one of the most unique and powerful abilities in the entire game, and that utility cannot be understated or overstated. So thank you so much for watching. I just want to make sure that everybody is also subscribing to the YouTube channel here. Please make sure you hit that subscribe button, like the comment, or like the video, comment in the subsection below, and let me know which operator I should review next. Thank you so much for watching, and I will make sure to see you again next time.